Well, in France, we have presently 58 nuclear reactors into operation and one under construction. And those 58 reactors under operation supply roughly between 75 and 78% of the French electricity, which accounts somehow for 40% of the primary energy which is consumed in France. The plants in France are not authorized for 40 years or 60 years like in the United States, for instance. In France, every 10 years there is a complete review of safety of the plants, and the safety authority end up with a bargain saying to the utility, well, if you want to have another 10 years of operation, then you have to make those improvements, those upgrades, you have to change such and such components, etc. So in fact, the plants are really continuously improved, at least on a 10-year basis. I think it's a very significant difference between France and the United States, for instance. So that means that even though some of the plants are now reaching 35 years, the oldest one, they have still been improved every 10 years. So the general state of the plant is pretty good. After the Fukushima accident, which you remember occurred in March 11, 2011, there was in France, like everywhere else, a new set of safety evaluations. In Europe, they were called the stress tests. In French, we call them the complementary safety evaluation. And they were somehow in two steps. First, are the plants presently under operation in agreement with the original specification concerning their resistance to aggression? And second, taking into account the Fukushima accident, to which extent do we need to improve this robustness? And this was carried out not only in the nuclear plants, but in all the nuclear facilities in France. During all the last summer, there were those evaluations carried out by the operators. Reports were submitted to the safety authority in September 2011. And then the safety authority and their technical support organization studied the reports. And there was a first advice emitted by the safety authority in January this year, which said somehow, one, yes, indeed, the plants are conform, are up to what was expected to them before, but two, now we request more of them, and so there will have to be specific upgrades. Upgrades in, let's say, in three categories. First, checking resistance to flood and seism, earthquakes, etc. Yes. Second, making sure how the plants react to the loss of external power and the loss of cooling water. And third, if it comes to an accident, how do we manage the crisis? And for instance, in all the nuclear plants of France, it has been decided to identify what is called hardcore, by saying that if there is an extraordinary earthquake or flood or whatever, the plant itself may suffer, but a number of very specific systems which are dedicated to making sure that this accident does not become a severe accident, those must survive much higher aggressions. So that's what we call the hardcore. And the second decision which has been taken is to set up what we call a fast action team, a bit like what they do sometimes in the army or the SWATs, if you want. So to train a number of people and prepare for them a number of materials spread across France to make sure that if there is an accident in a French plant or in a site where there are several plants at the same time, which was the case in Fukushima Daiichi, then within less than 24 hours, there will be a team of trained people to help and to take over somehow the local operators, which after 24 hours will be completely exhausted anyway, and they have with them all the material for instance, external electricity supply, additional water pumps or whatever, to be able to face an accident affecting all the units in one site and on all the French sites within 24 hours. So those are the two main improvements which have been triggered by the first lessons learned from the Fukushima accident. Later we have learned the lesson of Chernobyl, and we are trying to make sure not to miss the lesson of Fukushima. Nuclear power is a young technology somehow. The first nuclear reactor which was really developed to produce electricity and connected to the grid started in June '54 in Soviet Union, by the way. So it's a young technology. There is still a lot of margin for progress, either continuous progress or breakthroughs. And the basis of safety is we are never perfect. It has to be a continuous improvement. The vast majority of the nuclear reactors operating in the world are light water reactors and even pressurized water reactors, which account at least for 2/3 of the global world park fleet and 90% of the reactors under construction. Light water reactors are economical. But if there is a big development, a big renaissance, then the problem that light water reactors are so poor users of fissile materials will mean that we will have a generic problem of enough uranium for everybody. That's not a question today. Today the issue is moot, because today we have identified, let's say, 6 million tons of natural uranium identified. And we know that there is certainly an additional 12 million tons if we look at them somehow. And the total world energy consumption is 60,000 tons per year. So if the normal fleet doesn't increase, simply replacing the old plants by new plants, if you want, we know already identified enough uranium for more than 1 century. So the issue today is not a burning issue. But if instead of having 430 reactors in the world, we have 1,500, 2,000, then of course the situation will be quite different. And then we will have to change the technology to move to those kind of reactors, which usually we call generation 4, breeders, which make a much better use of the natural uranium resources. So you may ask, why don't we do it immediately? Well, the reason is they are more expensive. So as long as we are not under duress, under threat of scarcity, we build the light water reactors. But there's a law in France which had been enacted in 2006, which says that those wastes presently in interim storage, those long-lived wastes, will have to go into deep geological storage, into reversible geological storage, and that this repository has to be open by 2025. So that's the roadmap, which has been passed by an act of the Parliament, and we're in the process of narrowing the site selection for this repository, because we have already selected what would be the geological medium. It will be a big clay stratum, which is under all the Parisian basin, with a thickness of over 100 meters of good clayish material, and which had been stable for 125 million years. So the next milestone is very close to us. By 2015, the site itself, the precise site, will be approved, and the safety report will go into the long process of safety authorization. In France, UK, Japan, we consider that burying the spent fuel is a waste, because within the spent fuel you have indeed ultimate waste, but you have also a lot of recoverable material. There is still a lot of uranium and some plutonium which is in the spent fuel. And so in France, and it is also part of the law, by the way, we reprocess the spent fuel. So we don't send directly the spent fuel as a waste. We go in La Hague, we recover uranium and plutonium, we make new fuel with those materials, and what is really the final waste is conditioned. We make big glass blocks out of it, and those final waste will go to the repository. Many countries are presently have a policy of no policy, somehow, of a policy of saying there is no urgency to decide. In interim storage they are safe, we have still to survey, control them, but we can delay the decision because it is very difficult to get public acceptance of an actual repository. And so it's interesting to see that Finland and Sweden, which are democracies, have gone all the way to the process of political acceptance. It took a long time. And in France, we are not exactly as advanced as them, but we are really close along the way. In the United States, before 2009, it appeared to be also along the way. The repository in Yucca Mountain had already submitted its safety report to the NRC. It was proceeding. But then, after the Obama election, everything was put back to the back burner. That's a pity, really. Nuclear power is not a subject per se. Nuclear power is just one way of generating electricity. So the real subject is energy. Do we need energy or not? And you know that this is really at the crux of the big dilemma we have to face in this beginning of 21st century. How can we conciliate somehow the need for development on the one hand and the protection of the environment of the others? And energy is really at the crux of the matter, because without access to energy there is no development. But let's face it, if we go on using and producing energy the way we do, and taking into account the huge development of billions of people, which is the good news, then in terms of our environment we are really doomed for a catastrophe. We have to reduce drastically the use of oil, coal and gas. And if you do that, you don't have so many choices. It's nuclear and renewables. So we cannot shoot ourselves in the foot and say, okay, let's forget about nuclear. This big problem, nuclear is part of the solution, is not part of the problem. It's not the solution itself, of course. It doesn't have the scale, but it's part of the solution. And simply, if we don't increase the share of nuclear power reasonably, safely, then we know that we will not solve the problem, and we are doomed for some real climate change, and we don't know how we would adapt to this change, which will already occur anyway. But the rhythm, the pace at which climate change will happen, will make a lot of difference to the way we will be able or not to adapt to it. And I'll take just an example which is easy for Europe. If there is really a big climate change, that means that somehow all northern Africa will become uninhabitable. So the 300 million people living there will have to move to Europe. I'm not sure it will not be so easy socially to greet with pleasure an additional 300 million people. The risk of weapons proliferation exists irrespective of whether or not there is nuclear power. That's something which is very important. Take another example, which is today Israel, North Korea have nuclear weapons and do not have nuclear electricity. So you don't need civilian nuclear power to have weapons. The second, on the other hand, the question, which is quite legitimate, is does the development of civilian nuclear power increase or decrease a risk of proliferation which will never be zero whether or not you have nuclear power? And I say increase or decrease because the answer is rather subtle, because you have factor which goes both ways. So let's take the bad factors if you want. Indeed, if you spread a nuclear power, you spread the knowledge about nuclear physics. So the first proliferation is proliferation of brains somehow. But the genie is already out of the bottle. Since July 16, 1945, we know it is possible to make a nuclear weapon. But on the other hand, if you develop a civilian nuclear power, it is to answer a need. We go back to the reason. So if nuclear power is an important part of your energy mix, the fact of developing it means that you will have to enter into the international regime. You will have to sign and ratify the Non-Proliferation Treaty. You will have to sign and accept safeguards and inspections and control from the International Energy Agency of Vienna. And with the evolution of technology, those controls are really accurate now. And if we have now a North Korean crisis or an Iranian crisis, it is because indeed the inspectors have detected clandestine activities which were against the commitments of the country not to develop nuclear weapons. If we go back in time, in 1973, India was by far the most advanced nuclear country in the third world. They had two boiling water reactors supplied by the United States. They had one CANDU and another one under construction supplied by Canada. They had heavy water plants supplied by France. They had a small breeder also supplied by France. And they were by far the most advanced country. Then in 1974, they made their atomic explosion, which they claim to be a peaceful explosion called the Smiling Buddha. But this explosion was made by using plutonium extracted from the fuel of reactors supplied by Canada and fuel being supplied by the United States. So overnight, there was an embargo, and India was cut off from all external help to develop its nuclear power. And it was extremely long and difficult process for them to go on by themselves. Now, if you compare it to South Korea, in 1973, South Korea had no nuclear power at all. And now, it is the 5th producer in the world. So you see that there is if you want nuclear power to be part of your energy supply, there is a huge price to be paid for deciding to make nuclear weapons. My name is Bertrand Barré. I've been working in nuclear power for the last 45 or more years. I've been in charge of all the R&D on the nuclear reactors within the Atomic Energy Commission, the French CEA. And I've been in charge of all the R&D within Cogema about the fuel cycle, and Cogema, which is now integrated within AREVA. And also I've been for some time a nuclear attaché near the French embassy in Washington. That's part of my geopolitics interest. So in a few words, I think that settles me more or less. Now I'm retired, but still part-time scientific advisor to AREVA and teacher.